For more than 2 decades, Giorgio Tsoukalos stood in front of cameras and said things that the academic establishment dismissed, that the internet turned into a meme, and that millions of viewers found themselves unable to fully argue against no matter how hard they tried. He became the face of Ancient Aliens, the most watched and most debated paranormal documentary series in the history of cable television. He built a brand, an audience, and a platform from a single consuming obsession that most credentialed researchers would not touch with a 10-foot pole. And then, in the years that followed the peak of everything he built, something happened that the show and the meme and the platform were never designed to prepare him for. What happened to Giorgio Tsoukalos is not the story the internet tells about him. It is more complicated, more human, and more heartbreaking than the version most people know. Stay until the end. The complete story starts right now. Ancient Aliens premiered on the History Channel on March 8, 2009, as a 2-hour special that nobody at the network expected to become what it became. The premise was not new. The idea that extraterrestrial beings had visited Earth in ancient times and influenced the development of human civilization had been circulating in fringe literature since Erich von Däniken published Chariots of the Gods in 1968. What was new was the presentation. Ancient Aliens did not present its thesis as speculation or as one possible interpretation among many. It presented it as an investigation, a methodical, episode-by-episode examination of archaeological sites, ancient texts, religious traditions, and historical anomalies that the mainstream scientific community had either failed to explain satisfactorily or had chosen not to engage with at all. And at the center of that investigation, episode after episode, season after season, was Giorgio Tsoukalos. He was not the show's only contributor. Ancient Aliens assembled a rotating roster of researchers, authors, and theorists whose individual areas of expertise covered the full scope of the ancient astronaut thesis. But Tsoukalos was its constant, its anchor, the person whose presence in every episode gave the show a continuity and an identity that the rotating cast of contributors could not have provided on their own. And the reason he became that anchor was not simply that he was the show's producer, or that he had the longest professional history with the ancient astronaut theory. It was something the camera communicated directly and unmistakably. He believed it, not as a career strategy, not as a content formula, as a genuine and consuming conviction that he had carried since the moment he first encountered von Däniken's work as a teenager in Switzerland and felt the specific shock of recognition that comes when an idea lands in a mind that has been, without knowing it, waiting for exactly that idea. That quality of genuine belief is the thing that no production meeting can manufacture and that no amount of talent representation can substitute for. Viewers can feel the difference between a person performing conviction and a person expressing it. Giorgio Tsoukalos was always expressing it. And across 22 seasons of Ancient Aliens, that authenticity built an audience whose relationship to him went far beyond the ordinary parasocial connection that television produces. They trusted him, even the ones who disagreed with him, even the ones who watched specifically to argue with what he was saying. Something in the quality of his engagement with the material told them that this was a person who had staked something real on what he believed, and that the belief preceded the platform rather than being generated by it. What that staking cost him across 22 seasons is the part of his story the show was never built to tell. Giorgio Tsoukalos was born on March 14, 1978 in Lucerne, Switzerland. His father was Greek and his mother was Austrian, a combination of cultural inheritances that gave him a specific relationship to the ancient world that the purely academic Western European tradition does not always produce. He grew up in a household where the weight of history was not a school subject, but an ambient presence, where the civilizations of ancient Greece and the broader Mediterranean world were not distant abstractions but living inheritances whose significance was felt personally rather than professionally. That relationship to antiquity shaped the specific character of his later obsession in ways that are visible if you understand where he started. He was an athlete before he was a researcher, a competitive bodybuilder whose physical discipline gave him an early experience of what it means to pursue something with total commitment, regardless of whether the surrounding culture validates or understands the pursuit. He won the Swiss National Bodybuilding Championship in his youth. He trained with the specific, methodical intensity that championship competition requires. And then he encountered Erich von Däniken. He has described the encounter in multiple interviews across the years, always with the same quality of remembered impact. the way that people describe the books or the ideas that permanently altered the architecture of their understanding. He read Chariots of the Gods, and the question that the book placed in his mind did not leave. It did not soften with familiarity or dissolve under the pressure of academic skepticism. It intensified. and it sent him in a direction that the athletic career he had been building could not have predicted, and that his family and his social world were not entirely prepared to follow him into. He moved to the United States. He studied sports information and communication at Ithaca College in New York. He built a life in a new country organized around the pursuit of an idea that the mainstream research community treated as not worth pursuing. And he connected with Eric von Däniken himself, becoming the publisher's liaison and the primary institutional representative of the ancient astronaut theory in the English-speaking world through an organization called Legendary Times, which he founded and ran for years before Ancient Aliens gave the theory the platform that transformed everything. The person who showed up on the History Channel in 2009 was not a television personality who had been handed a concept and a wardrobe. He was a person who had spent the better part of a decade building a professional life around something most people in his position would never have had the courage to commit to publicly. In 2012, 3 years into Ancient Aliens' run, something happened to Giorgio Tsoukalos that no publicist could have anticipated, and no crisis management strategy was designed to handle. A screenshot from one of his appearances on the show, featuring his increasingly elaborate hair and an expression of animated enthusiasm, was extracted from its context and circulated on the internet as a reaction image. The caption, in the format that the internet's meme culture had standardized for expressing absurd certainty, read simply, "I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens." Within weeks, it was one of the most recognized meme formats online. Within months, it had been viewed and shared hundreds of millions of times. Within a year, it had become the dominant frame through which a significant portion of the internet understood who Giorgio Tsoukalos was and what Ancient Aliens was about. He has spoken about the meme in interviews with a generosity that, when you understand what it actually did to his professional standing in the research community he had spent a decade building credibility within, represents a quality of equanimity that is harder to maintain than it appears. The meme was funny. He acknowledged that immediately and consistently. It was not mean-spirited in the way that internet attention can be mean-spirited, and it brought a scale of visibility to Ancient Aliens that no advertising budget could have purchased. The show's ratings climbed as the meme spread. The audience that found Ancient Aliens through the meme was not always the audience that engaged seriously with the content, but it was an audience, and television runs on audience. What the meme did to his credibility within the research community he cared about was a different calculation. The ancient astronaut theory had always existed at the edge of what serious researchers would publicly engage with. The meme moved it further from that edge. It became harder to have a substantive conversation about the evidence and the arguments when the primary cultural association of the conversation's central figure was a joke image format. Researchers and academics who might have been willing to engage critically with the thesis in a format that took it seriously were now more likely to decline, because association with the subject had been colored by an internet phenomenon whose comedic framing made serious engagement feel ridiculous by proximity. Giorgio Tsoukalos spent years working to be taken seriously. The meme made that work harder in ways that were invisible to the hundreds of millions of people sharing the image and completely visible to the person in the photograph. Ancient Aliens has run for 22 seasons. That number requires a moment of genuine consideration, because it is a number that places the show in a category that almost nothing in cable television history occupies. It is not simply that the show ran for a long time. It is that it ran for a long time while covering a subject that the mainstream scientific establishment consistently dismissed, that the educational community refused to engage with seriously, and that the broader media culture treated with a skepticism that ranged from gentle condescension to active ridicule. 22 seasons of that specific headwind is a different achievement than 22 seasons of a cooking competition or a home renovation series. It required something from the people making it that those other formats do not require. For Giorgio Tsoukalos, 22 seasons meant 22 seasons of being the public face of a thesis that carried enormous professional risk for everyone associated with it. 22 seasons of interviews in which the default posture of the interviewer was either amused skepticism or outright dismissal. 22 seasons of being the person whose name appeared in academic papers and mainstream media articles as the exemplar of pseudoscientific thinking, of intellectual irresponsibility, of the failure of popular media to apply appropriate evidentiary standards. He absorbed all of it. He continued. He showed up for every episode, every interview, every convention appearance, every public engagement with the same quality of undiminished enthusiasm and conviction that had characterized his first appearance on the show in 2009. That consistency across 22 seasons of sustained criticism from the institutions that the broader culture regards as arbiters of intellectual legitimacy is not a small thing. It is the specific kind of resilience that only genuine belief produces. and that only genuine belief can sustain across that duration. What it produced in him personally, the cumulative weight of 2 decades of public dismissal on the one side and internet fame on the other, with the actual work of serious investigation conducted in the space between those two forces, is the chapter of his story that the episode count does not convey. He is a human being who has spent his entire adult professional life being told, by the institutions that most people defer to on questions of intellectual credibility, that the thing he believes most deeply and has staked his entire career on is not worth believing. The psychological texture of living inside that specific tension across 22 seasons is something the show's enthusiastic opening sequences were never designed to document. The version of Giorgio Tsoukalos that the Ancient Aliens audience knows is a carefully specific version. It is the version that exists in front of cameras, at conventions, in interviews, and in the public appearances that his platform requires. It is enthusiastic, accessible, warm, and entirely organized around the thesis that has been the center of his professional life since before the show existed. What exists behind that version, the personal life that the production schedule and the public persona create around rather than within, has been addressed only partially in the interviews and public communications that constitute his accessible record. He was married. The relationship ended. The specific demands of a professional life built around continuous production, international travel for location shoots, convention appearances across multiple countries, and the sustained public visibility that 22 seasons of a cable television show generates are not demands that make the ordinary architecture of domestic life easy to maintain. He has spoken about the difficulty of sustaining personal relationships alongside a career whose requirements are as consuming as his has been. He has spoken about it without bitterness and without the specific performance of philosophical acceptance that people sometimes deploy to avoid engaging with genuine loss. He has spoken about it the way a person speaks about something they have processed honestly rather than explained away. What his personal life looks like, away from the cameras and the convention floors and the History Channel production schedules, is something that the people who know him describe in terms that are consistent with what the public record suggests, but that carry more texture and more weight. A person of genuine intellectual depth whose public persona, by necessity and by the specific demands of the format that made him famous, expresses only a portion of that depth. A person whose private reading, whose genuine engagement with archaeological literature and ancient history and the broader scientific questions that surround his thesis, is considerably more rigorous and more nuanced than the television format that brought him to public attention has ever had room to show. And a person who has carried the specific loneliness of a professional life, organized around an idea that the surrounding culture does not validate, for long enough that the loneliness has become part of the landscape rather than an intrusion into it. The dismissal of Giorgio Tsoukalos and the ancient astronaut theory by the mainstream scientific and academic establishment has always rested on a foundation that the dismissal itself tends not to examine. The assumption that the questions the theory raises have been satisfactorily answered by existing scholarship, that the archaeological record fully explains the construction of the structures the ancient astronaut thesis points to, that the ancient texts whose content the theory interprets as describing extraterrestrial contact have been adequately accounted for by conventional historical and religious analysis. These assumptions are less solid than the confidence with which they are typically deployed suggests. The construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza, the Nazca Lines of Peru, the megalithic structures at Pumapunku in Bolivia, the ancient astronomical alignments at sites across multiple continents whose precision exceeds what the tools and knowledge attributed to the civilizations that built them would appear to permit. These are not manufactured mysteries. They are documented features of the archaeological record that credentialed researchers have debated for decades without producing explanations that satisfy every dimension of what the evidence presents. The ancient astronaut thesis offers one framework for interpreting those features. It is not the framework that the mainstream archaeological community endorses, but the dismissal of it as inherently absurd, as not worth serious engagement, depends on the prior assumption that the conventional explanations are more complete than the evidence actually demonstrates them to be. Giorgio Tsoukalos has spent 22 seasons making precisely this argument, not always with the evidentiary precision that academic publication would require, not always with the methodological rigor that peer review demands. but with a genuine engagement with the questions that the archaeological record raises and a consistent refusal to accept that those questions have been answered simply because the institutions responsible for answering them are uncomfortable with the implications of leaving them open. That the culture chose to engage with his argument primarily through a meme rather than through the substance of what he was saying is the specific irony of his career, and it is the part of his story that the people who dismissed him were never positioned to recognize as ironic at all. There are things about Giorgio Tsoukalos' health across the years of Ancient Aliens production that the public record addresses only at its edges, in the way that a person's physical reality tends to appear in the public record of a media career, as occasional absences, as changed appearances across seasons, as the kind of documentary evidence that exists without being narrated. 22 seasons of production constitute a significant portion of an adult life. The travel that the show requires, the location shoots on multiple continents under conditions that range from physically demanding to genuinely extreme, the convention circuit that his public profile requires him to maintain in the gaps between production, the sustained high-visibility existence that a platform of this scale generates whether or not the person at its center has the resources to manage it comfortably. These are not abstract professional demands. They are physical ones, and they accumulate across 22 seasons in ways that become visible to the people who watch closely enough and over long enough a span. He has not spoken extensively about his health in public forums. That discretion is consistent with the general quality of his public communications, which tend toward enthusiasm and forward engagement rather than personal disclosure. But the people in his proximity across the production years have described a person whose physical resources have been drawn on more heavily and for longer than the cheerful convention footage and the enthusiastic episode appearances communicate to an outside audience. The specific costs of sustaining a public presence at the scale that Ancient Aliens generated, across a career that began in the late 1990s and has not significantly contracted since, are costs that the platform's visibility makes easy to miss and that the person carrying them has every professional incentive not to foreground. Giorgio Tsoukalos at 48 years old is a person whose public profile and whose private reality exist in a gap that the platform he built has made wider rather than narrower across the years of its operation. The meme has not gone away. Ancient Aliens has not ended. The convention appearances continue. The interviews continue. The public engagement with the Ancient Astronaut thesis continues with the same quality of undiminished conviction that it had in 2009, when the show was new and the meme was years in the future and the accumulated weight of 22 seasons had not yet been accumulated. What has changed is everything that the platform cannot capture: the personal losses, the health that 2 decades of sustained production have affected in ways he has not fully disclosed, the specific quality of a professional life so completely organized around a single public identity that the question of who he is outside that identity has become genuinely difficult to answer in the way that it becomes difficult for anyone who has given everything to a single thing for long enough. The friendships that the production schedule has made difficult to sustain. The relationships that the demands of his particular career have rendered more complicated than they might otherwise have been. The private intellectual life, the reading and the thinking and the genuine engagement with the questions his thesis raises, that the meme format has made systematically invisible to the broader culture that knows his face and repeats his catchphrases without engaging with the substance of what he has spent his life arguing. He continues, "That is the thing about Giorgio Tsoukalos that the heartbreaking dimension of his story cannot change. He continues with the specific quality of a person for whom the alternative to continuing is not rest or recalibration, but the abandonment of the thing that organized his entire adult life around itself, and that he has never found a compelling reason to stop believing. The thesis is still open. The questions are still unanswered. The archaeological record still contains features that conventional scholarship has not fully explained. And somewhere in that persistent openness, in those unanswered questions, in that unexplained evidence, is the reason that Giorgio Tsoukalos gets up every day and does the thing he has always done, not because it has made him wealthy beyond imagination, though it has given him a living, not because it has earned him the respect of the institutions whose validation most people in his position would have pursued, because it has cost him that validation rather than earning it, but because he looked at something as a teenager in Switzerland and it changed the architecture of his understanding permanently, and everything that has happened since: the show, the meme, the 22 seasons, the health costs, The personal losses, the sustained dismissal from the mainstream, the sustained devotion from an audience that found in his conviction something they could not find elsewhere, has been the consequence of that single irreversible change. That is what happened to Giorgio Tsoukalos, and it is the most human story that Ancient Aliens ever contained, visible in every episode, hidden in plain sight across every season, waiting in the question that has never been answered and that he has never stopped asking. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe now and turn your notifications on.